Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, I'll be talking with Dave Montgomery and Anne Biklé about their new book, What Your Food Ate: How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. The authors aim to raise our awareness of the community of life in the soil beneath our feet, or more importantly, the soil and the farms that grow our food. They make a compelling case for changing the ways that food is grown, so that the life of the soil is respected and cared for, and so that the food produced by healthier soil makes us healthier in turn.
We're basically looking for a new philosophical foundation for farming that promotes the life in the soil and the benefits that can flow from that. And also we're hoping to basically encourage people to think more, not just about what they eat, but where their food came from, how it was raised, quite literally what their food ate.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Dave, and thank you so much for being on the podcast to talk about your new book. Perhaps as a way to orient our listeners, you could tell us a bit about yourselves and the things that you're invested in these days. And let's start with you.
Describing myself, that's always a challenge in a way, Forrest, because it sort of depends on, what's on my mind and what I'm working on at any given moment. But I would say that my training and background are in biology and the environmental sciences. And so that's fertile ground these days between the condition of our planet at large and my interests in gardening and the botanical world and how we treat the land and what that means for our health, the health of the land. So I guess if I were to just sort of put a label on myself, as much as I hate doing those things, I'd say I'm somewhere between a free-range biologist and a plant whisperer.
Dave, how about you? Tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm a geologist by training. I teach at the University of Washington, teaching geomorphology, which is the here and now of geology, what shapes terrain and topography. And I've gotten very interested in the state of the world of soils and working on a series of books, half of which are co-authored with Anne, and look really at the history of agriculture, the way societies in the world have degraded land time and again, how microbial life in the soil is sort of the key to soil fertility and building resilient, productive agriculture, how farmers can do that, and then working on the new book with Anne and trying to communicate the connections between why soil health translates into human health and all the various little steps in between on that whole complicated series of connections.
So let's talk about your new book. It's called What Your Food Ate: How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. How would you sum up the essential purpose of the book, and who is it you're trying to reach?
I would say that the central purpose of the book was trying to really explore the relationships between how we treat the land cascades into how the land can treat us. And there's various steps along the way that Anne and I broke into how the way farming practices affects the health of the soil, how the health of the soil affects the health of crops and plants, how the health of crops and what gets into crops and plants affects the health of livestock and animals, and then how all that rolls up to influence human health. So we're trying to look at all the little steps along the way and those connections. We know that a lot of things affect our health. There's our genes, whether we get any exercise, what we choose to eat. But what we wanted to explore for this new book was how the way we raise our food can affect our health. In other words, what our food ate. And who we're trying to really reach is, after researching this book, and I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to speak for Anne and I on this, I think that most people really ought to know more about how their food is raised and why it's important to think about that in terms of what they're getting delivered in their diet. Anne and I view our role as, in effect, scientific translators trying to take stuff out of the journals and communicate it more broadly to people who ought to have access to the information that's kind of tucked away in these technical specialty publications. And there's a lot there that I think more people ought to have the benefit of knowledge so that when they make choices about what they eat, they can be doing them in a more fully informed manner.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I have to add to that was a sense I came away from the book with is I'm learning so much and I'm learning how much I don't know. I'm learning how much I don't have access to these crucial details about where my food is coming from, how it's produced, all of that. So it kind of left me with a bit of restlessness as well. But I think it's a good thing, right? It makes me want to learn more as a consumer. And want to add to that?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is I'm pleased. This might sound odd, Forrest, but I'm actually pleased that you're realizing how much you don't know about this topic in this area, because one of our objectives, and Dave shares this, but for me in particular, it's really important to me that the people who are reading the books, the Dirt trilogy, the three before this, as well as this one, is I want people to be equipped with knowledge and information so that they can decide what it is that they want to do. Do they want to know more or less about where their food came from and what their food ate? It's always been my personal experience that if somebody just sort of tells me what to do, what comes up for me is, first of all, why are you telling me that? Second of all, I have my own mind and I'd like to decide what to do about this or that subject. And so it's always thrilling for me to hear that somebody is learning something and that somebody is thinking about acting on the information, the stories, the other things that are in the book. To me, that's part of the answer to your question about who is this book for. And I suppose I would say to that, it's for a person who is interested in learning new things and expanding their horizons and examining how their life on this planet is impacting themselves and other people, and what might they do to be, I guess, going in a direction that's going to improve and enhance their life as well as the lives of others in just how they carry out the basic thing of living.
Yeah, and I think the danger of writing a book that really is based in science is that you could alienate people and make them feel that they know so little that why try and why read this book? But that is not what this book does. Your word translate, I think, is a good one because both of you intrigue us along the way, making us want to know more and more as you explain these interesting studies that have happened, these elements of research that expose mysteries of the soil. I mean, it's an approach that I think is really democratic in the sense that it welcomes everyone to learn more and want to know more.
Yeah.
Now, it seems clear that your vocations and your advocacy for the environment are rooted in deep connections to the natural world. When you look back to your formative years, how were those connections inspired? Maybe what were some of the shaping experiences in your lives?
I was a kid who kind of grew up spending a lot of time outdoors. And where was that? I was in the suburbs of Denver, actually. And one of my early childhood experiences, I remember it must have been early June. And I was maybe about 4 or 5 years old. So not very tall. The world looked immense and large and green to me at that time of year in that kind of an environment. And I remember walking around, modest sized yard. My parents had put rock gardens in, and I'd say nature kind of took over in some respects. But I remember coming across this plant that I had to look up to. And I'd lift my arms up and pull the flower down into my face. And this plant was an iris. And I will never, ever forget the fragrance of that iris to this day and how it made me feel and what a wonderful thing that I had stumbled onto. And it was a thing of beauty and fragrance and all of it. And that was sort of the beginning of my exploration and immersing myself in the world of plants. And then from there, I just continued to spend time outside. And I've always been a curious person, Forrest. So I'm constantly asking questions. Why this thing? Why that thing? How come this plant's dying? Why is this plant thriving? And so on. So being outside, immersed in nature was a big part of my development, both as a young person and then into adulthood.
That's so funny. That image of you pulling the iris down to smell it, I just had a flashback. I was probably the same age as you were with my sister in my grandma's garden. And there were a bunch of California poppies there. And we had just had a poppy seed muffin. And I thought, hey, well, if poppy seed muffins taste awesome, this flower must also. So we both pulled the flower down and stuck our tongue right in it. And we learned our lesson. But yeah. Yeah. Anyway, I'm not sure where that came to mind. So.
Oh, it's great. It's great.
Dave, how about you?
Well, it's funny you mentioned California poppies. I grew up in California, and the natural beauty of California is renowned. And I did a lot of hiking as a teenager, loved the outdoors. And when I got very interested in biology in high school, and then in college got diverted into geology, and that really sort of fed on a fascination for landscapes and terrain. I used to love maps as a kid, was fascinated with geography and spatial arrangements of things, and loved landforms, and feel very fortunate that I was able to essentially pursue studying that in the end for a profession. It was sort of a long, circuitous path to get there, but I think it really did feed on a long-running innate appreciation for the beauty of landscapes and a fascination for how they work, how they're shaped, and also, in the end, professionally now, sort of how the way people live on the land affects the way the land can affect future generations of people.
So, practically speaking, what are the essential changes that you're calling for in the book, or maybe hoping for that the book will inspire?
Well, I think a key change that we're really interested in spreading views on are the way we think about the soil, the way we think about the land, and our connection to it, and how the way that we treat the land ripples back up into the way that the land treats us. And so there's sort of two aspects, one in terms of farming practices, that we would like to see more soil building, soil friendly, more regenerative farming practices that would actually enhance the health and fertility of the world's soils as the foundation for farming. Think we're basically looking for a new philosophical foundation for farming that promotes the life in the soil and the benefits that can flow from that. And also we're hoping to basically encourage people to think more, not just about what they eat, but where their food came from, how it was raised, quite literally what their food ate.
For me, I think the most important takeaway was having to do with the nature of food and what happens to food when it's grown in certain ways, and how that ultimately benefits our health or detracts from our health. I'm wondering if you could talk just a bit more about that. When you address health issues in people, you come up with some really good supportive information and statistics about health, particularly in North America, for example. And I'm wondering if you could maybe summarize the problem that you're trying to address. What is it that a change in the way we grow our food might actually address in terms of people's health?
Nutrition and the way we think about our bodies and the interactions between food and our bodies have been, I think, too narrow. And we mostly think about food in terms of calories, too much or too little. But one of the things that farming practices most influence about foods in the human diet is not so much related to calories, but it's related to these sort of three broad groups of what we call nutrients. Not all nutritionists would consider all of these things nutrients, and that's where maybe the way that scientists look at things haven't always been so helpful. But these three broad things, Forrest, are the most familiar to everybody is going to be fats. Fats are an incredibly diverse group of compounds and molecules. We often think, there's either saturated fats or there's unsaturated fats, and that's way, way too simplistic. They're a hugely interesting kind of compound found in plants, found in animal foods. So that's one broad area. The other one is phytochemicals. And so these are what plants are able to make by virtue of being a plant. And people will know phytochemicals by other names. One of them, for example, is beta carotene. So this is what makes carrots and foods in the squash family orange. And these phytochemicals help us because they don't really become, say, a part of our skin, or say the way calcium or magnesium gets incorporated into our skeleton. Phytochemicals don't really become a part of our cells and tissues, but what they do is they help our cells and tissues function normally. And one of the most important things they do is they're sort of our body's fix-it system. And when I say that, I don't mean just like one tool or like a screwdriver or a hammer. I mean, think about phytochemicals like the entire suite of things that you might find in a hardware store. So you got mops, you got detergents, you certainly have a lot of tools, you got duct tape, bungee cords, all of this stuff. And phytochemicals are absolutely essential to make sure that our bodies can fix things and so that we can keep going on living and, most importantly, be living a healthy life. And then that third category of things is for sure things like vitamins and minerals. And these, again, some of these things become a part of our cells and tissues. Others have this more of a facilitator role, like phytochemicals. They're sort of what just helps our bodies function normally. So phytochemicals, micronutrients, which include vitamins and minerals, and then fats. These three broad things are what farming practices can really influence. And maybe, Dave, you could take it from there and fill in any gaps.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are the three things that in our review of the literature and some of the testing that we did too, it seems that how we treat the soil affects soil life in ways that in turn affect how much of those compounds, micronutrients, phytochemicals, and fats are actually getting into our food supply. And you look in the medical literature, and there's lots of evidence that suggests that we want more of those things rather than less of them in our food. It can be difficult to basically connect how, if you change your diet in a specific way and eat a certain thing grown off a certain farm, how will that affect your health in a particular way? I mean, that's asking a lot to be able to make those kinds of connections. But in the general sense of what would make for a healthier diet for people, it sure seems like whole foods grown in healthy, fertile soils offer more of the compounds that we don't just need to be alive, but that will help us thrive, that will actually support our health. And that's really a key message of the book, is that there's been changes in the composition, the mix of fats, the amount of micronutrients, the amount of phytochemicals in our diet as a consequence of adopting conventional farming practices today. But the good news is that there's every reason to think that a lot of that can be actually reversed and that we can re-increase the amount of those things in our diet or change the balance of them in the case of fats through adopting different agricultural practices. Yeah, and practices that actually can work for farmers and that actually turn out to be better for the soil, better for the land, better for the climate. There's a lot of reasons to argue for a different style of farming practices that can actually produce comparable yields at an economically competitive manner.
My brother has been trying to persuade me to pay attention to the sort of inflammatory and anti-inflammatory properties of food, and it just kind of always goes over my head. But I read this book, and you're totally backing him up. And I have now I'm looking at everything. I grow my own food. I grow my own vegetables. I give them away mostly because I have this really simple, boring diet. But now I'm thinking, no, I got to eat those peas. I need to learn how to like kale. So I'm inspired really to start making some changes because of those benefits, the health benefits I just don't think I was quite aware of. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I have to say that one of the things I learned from reading this book, I think I had my view of what constitutes healthy food expanded a bit. We all know that processed food loses a lot, right? And it's not good for you for so many reasons. Maybe some of us buy organic because we're told that it's better for you as well. But I think what amazed me was the nature of the things that are grown in certain ways is fundamentally different if they're not grown in ways that, say, rely on regenerative techniques or rely on building the soil even as you're growing the plants. But instead, so much of our food is grown with chemical fertilizers and the sort of monoculture approach. I'm wondering, just for listeners, you could perhaps describe the difference between the approaches. On the one hand, we have regenerative approaches, and on the other, there's something that's a bit more industrial, a bit more efficiency-oriented. But how would you describe the fundamental difference?
Well, I mean, the key pillars of conventional agriculture today are a lot of tillage, using a lot of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and other agrochemicals, and growing one or two crops primarily, whether on a farm or in a field or in a very simple crop rotations. And it turns out that, those methods were adopted as a means to try and boost yields in the mid 20th century. And coupled with crop breeding for the Green Revolution, it helped boost crop yields. But in focusing on growing calories as our one sort of metric, yield above all else, we overlooked how those practices undermined the connections between life in the soil, between fungi in the soil and bacteria in the soil, the kind of life that Ann and I called the hidden half of nature, the sort of out of sight, out of mind, microscopic, invisible stuff in the soil we don't tend to pay much attention to, but that plants do, because they form partnerships with them for some 450 million years that actually bolster their health and help them acquire mineral micronutrients, vitamins, and make phytochemicals. Now, more regenerative practices and techniques would be those that actually cultivate the beneficial life in the soil and actually try and rebuild soil organic matter that the conventional practices degrade over time. And those practices involve minimizing disturbance, both chemical and physical. So using less tillage or no-till practices, not plowing or plowing very sparingly, minimizing the use of synthetic fertilizers and agrochemicals, if not eliminating them altogether, and growing a diversity of crops, whether in the cover crops planted in between a cash crop or growing a diversity of cash crops. And that combination of no-till, cover crops, and diversity is really a recipe for cultivating the beneficial life in the soil and those communities of life in the soil that partner with plants to actually enhance the health and viability of both. So there's a pretty fundamental difference in just the nature of practices in what have been shown over the course of history to be degenerative in the sense that they degrade soil fertility, and our conventional mix of practices falls into that category today, and the regenerative practices that can help rebuild soil fertility.
Oh, I was just going to add, considering everything that Dave just said, in the larger context, a lot of us might think, oh, these domesticated plants and animals, they probably can't do much on their own. They've been under our yoke for so long. They really need our help. They need us to fertilize them. They need us to take care of them. And what I think many of the regenerative techniques and methods that farmers all over the place are now pioneering and looking into, what they're really revealing is that, these plants and animals might be a part of agriculture, but they still have this fundamental biology, which is about forming these symbiotic or beneficial relationships with the other life forms that are around them or in them. And that's really important to remember, because one of the most unhelpful aspects of modern agriculture is that from tillage to certain kinds of agrochemicals, mostly they interfere or scuttle or, that metaphor about jamming a monkey wrench into something. That's unfortunately what too many modern farming methods are doing when it comes to how domesticated plants and animals are still, working at developing and sustaining these partnerships with especially soil life in the case of crops. And in the case of animals, it's their own microbiomes. And, we go into that a bit in the book with animals. But that's the larger context in which to think about all of this, is that it's really hard to get in there. And we've managed to do it in too many places on our planet, but it's pretty hard to get in there and try and push nature in a direction that she does not want to go. And it ends up creating problems. So, despite the domestication of plants and animals in agriculture, they still have these wild roots, and they still have genomes and microbiomes that are nature's products that it would really behoove us to learn more about and work with instead of work over.
So I want to point out something that both of you are doing right now, and you are using this relationship language, which I just find so fascinating. You're using relationship and community and partnership. And in a way, what that does for me is it's respectful. It's respectful of the other parts of the community that this system is. You sort of grant them beinghood by acknowledging that they're capable of partnership and collaboration, really. I just find that inspiring and challenging, because it challenges me to maybe become more aware of my interconnection, of my relationship that extends all the way down to mycorrhizal beings, and these tiny little things in the soil. It really kind of opens up a realm of mystery for me, I have to say, in a very good way, and makes, again, me want to learn more about that. Mm-hmm. We in the Circlewood community and in the community of this podcast, we talk a lot about indigenous culture because especially North American native cultures have taught us a lot about this idea of relationship and about really understanding the fact that creation or nature is really made up of beings, and that if we think in those terms, we're more respectful. We're more likely to be less abusive, less objectifying. In your book, you do mention native cultures and indigenous diets a few times, but I'm wondering if you could comment on what, if anything, you have observed about native cultures, indigenous cultures worldwide, really, and how they actually are looking at this interconnection, this community with the soil, with food, with their environment. Is that a factor in how you've been thinking about this?
There's a long history in indigenous and traditional societies around the world at adopting practices to help sustain soil fertility, to try and maintain the productivity of the land. And people all around the world independently discovered that, planting legumes in some sequence in with your crops can actually help the next crop grow. They may not have understood about microbial life and nitrogen fixation and all that, but they had very strong, empirically grounded views of relationships between how they treated the land, what they should do in what sequence. There's the famous example in terms of diversity of crops with the three sisters in terms of North American agriculture, squash, beans, and corn. And so the ideas of crop rotation and the ideas of planting legumes in a rotation and trying to care and steward for the soil are ideas that have deep roots around the world. And when we look at the regenerative practices today, it's trying to couple some of that ancient wisdom, those old ideas of crop rotations and diversity, and couple that with the ideas of minimal disturbance and how you can actually do no-till farming at a large scale. Because one of the challenges here is, how do you take that kind of traditional wisdom and couple it with modern technology to farm at a large scale, dare I say an industrial scale? Because, industrial is not necessarily a bad word in the sense that it can allow a few people to produce things that a lot of people can use. But what goes into an industrial process and how you run it is really the question. And so could we make large-scale farming more soil-friendly, more life-friendly to the life in the soil, and therefore more beneficial to life above ground, including us? And that's where I think we see the real promise here of coupling ancient wisdom and modern technology, trying to figure out new ways to do things with minimal disturbance that builds on those kinds of traditional ideas.
And what would you say about community?
Whether you're a gardener or a farmer or just the average person who maybe has never grown a plant in your life, finding ways to be out in nature and to be thinking about why things are the way they are, it begins to give you sort of a platform and a foundation for asking questions about the effects of your own practices or the effects of your own behavior on a larger community, on other beings, whether that is some harmless little microbe in the soil to your pet, to a wild animal or a wild plant. And indigenous cultures, by their very nature, have always been embedded in the natural world because that's where their cultures developed and evolved and all of that. And so I'm always heartened and also, I guess, shocked in some ways, but I'm really heartened with farmers who we talk with who say things like, all these years I've been farming and I never thought about soil life. And to me, I'm thinking, what do you mean? All these years you've been farming, you never thought about this? But what's cool is that they then say, but now I'm starting to think about that. And I find these small epiphanies to be really heartening because the minute you can sort of open up somebody's mind just a little bit to this notion and idea that we're all part of this much larger community of life, then you begin to get at, well, since we're part of this community, me, my body, my home, my family, maybe I should be thinking about ways to take better care of that community since I now see that I am a part of it. And this is the work that is ahead of all of us in terms of what we choose to eat, how much we choose to learn about what our food ate, and all of these kinds of things. So I've often been just so impressed with how indigenous cultures and indigenous people think about things. I'm all for multiple perspectives given the state of the planet and the kinds of problems that are out there that we have to solve. And I like having a lot of minds thinking about that.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on this idea of once we see ourselves as part of the community, it does at least give us different choices to make. It makes us ask, well, what is my place? What is my responsibility? What is my part in all of this? I will say that reading this book, I came away with a kind of mixed feeling at the end because I kept getting stuck on the question, who am I and what could I possibly do to impact this sort of massive entrenched system of industrial agriculture that rules so much of the world? And maybe that's my question for you. How can I, or any of us as individuals, hope to promote change when the dysfunction of our food-growing industry seems to be mostly in the hands of corporations and governments and systems that are seemingly beyond our control, our influence?
Yeah, I mean, we get asked this a lot, Forrest, and it's a really tough question, and it's a really good question, because ultimately that's going to be the route to solutions and to getting people writ large, from your average consumer to a farmer to an elected official, to get this collection of humanity to see that better stewardship for the soil is the way that we get better health for ourselves, better outcomes for the planet. If we can support the elected officials that are on the same page as we are with respect to everything that we talk about in the book and that we've been talking about here, then they can be the change makers within their own community of politics and elected officials. And a lot of that starts hyper-local. I'm thinking of schools and how a lot of this education and change starts with educating kids early on. I mean, I think about just how far recycling has come. And it's kind of funny. I was working on my father throughout my adult life to be a recycler. And he never recycled. His generation just wasn't that way. And I would say at times I had success with him, but I was still digging stuff out of the garbage. Dad, this can, it is not something to throw away. And I was not even, as a kid, there was not like a recycling curriculum or something like that. But I think when it comes to education today, getting kids involved with questions about where's my food come from and how do we grow it? And, there's this thing called soil life. We're working with somebody now they have ideas about doing a children's book sort of about the microbial world in our body and in the soil. And their observations are really interesting in that they've got a young child and their kid is incredibly interested about his body, what goes on in there. And we're talking with him about the tiny doctors and the tiny farmers that are in our bodies and that are in the soil. And so I think there's a mind shift that can happen between the young and the old, between the unelected and the elected. And that this is, at the hyper-local level of a family to the hyper-local level of an organization maybe like yours that are supporting farms and farmers that are interested in soil health. Because it's sort of like this when it comes, I think sort of the bottom line on agriculture is that we're looking for agricultural practices that as a consequence of those very practices leave the soil and the soil community better off at the end of a harvest season, not worse off. And that if you replicate that year after year, we are turning agriculture into an asset to the planet and to humanity rather than a liability. And so I like this idea of communities that are hyper-local, from schools and organizations in your local community, all the way up to the national level, and to be talking about constantly the need to consider ourselves a part of this larger community and to be working it on all fronts from the micro to the macro.
Dave, what would you say to people who are asking the question, well, what can I really do?
Well, I would say there's really sort of three different scales of the sort of what can I do question. The one is like, well, what are you eating and where are you getting it? How is it being grown and how much do you know about it? So learning more about how the food one has access to and the food one is choosing between, wherever one is getting it, and then following through on those choices to try and support the farming practices that you think are most appropriate. And that could be buying food from a farmer at a farmer's market where you actually can talk with them and go, what are your actual practices? That's sort of the most information you can have. In the grocery stores, there's various labels, various regenerative farming labels that are being proposed and being rolled out that will have some connection to practices that actually build and maintain soil health. There's the organic label. The many organic farms are actually very good in the way that they treat the soil. Not all of them. Some of them till too much. But if all you have is the label at the store, that's probably better than a conventional label in terms of how the soil is being treated on average across, all the farms in America. So at the individual level, one could basically think about, well, vote with your food dollars. Support the kind of farming that you would like to see spread. At another level is that there's sort of other ways that the kind of changes can be supported in agriculture. In farming communities, in terms of looking at learning about the regenerative practices and how they can be more economical for farms and taking an experiment to try and adopt them on a corner of a farm to actually see how that pans out. And then, of course, there's the public policy angle. So there's sort of the individual consumer demand and how we spend our dollars. There's the ground up farmer interest in regenerative practices because they increasingly make economic sense for the farmers. And I've yet to meet a farmer that wanted to degrade their land. Met a lot of farmers who are either indifferent or would like to improve the health of their soil, but haven't met anybody that wants to degrade it, even though that's what conventional agriculture has been doing for 100 years. And then at the third level, there's the public policy. And that's where Ann's sort of comments about elected representatives come in. Farm Bill is up for renewal today. If you want to have an impact, contact your legislative representatives, whether at the state or at the federal level, and encourage them to support measures to support farmers who are engaging in or adopting regenerative farming practices. There's political pressure that can be brought to bear to try and educate and encourage our elected representatives to try and reshape our agricultural subsidies, our agricultural incentives, our agricultural policies in ways to actually promote and regenerative farming and to benefit farmers who adopt those practices. So there's top down, there's bottom up, and there's individual choices that all really matter. But when you really think about what shapes the world, even though there are billions of us, it's the way we live our lives and the individual actions that we take in our lives that collectively add up to the human footprint on the planet. And the one thing that we can influence in that fairly confidently is our own individual footprint. And if enough of us make changes to things, the world actually changes, for the better or worse.
Yeah, I really love that. The fact that you're really bringing it down to the level of individual responsibility. Maybe I want to call it opportunity, because there just are things we can do. And I think it takes courage. It takes creativity to think about what we might do with our particular resources, strengths, ideas. To think of the children's curriculum that focuses on life of the soil. That's just really unique and creative and amazing. But I think there are so many other great ideas out there if we free ourselves to have them. I'm thinking, to pick up on your idea, Anne, of it's always good to have multiple perspectives. We have a global listening audience, and we often try to get ideas from, as many different locales as we can. And what comes to mind is a couple of women in South Africa who started this thing they call the Good Food Clubs. And they really started it because they realized that they didn't know how to support regenerative farming because they had no idea where their food came from. So they made it their task to gather some friends around them and figure that out. And so they began to create these co-ops where they were buying food from farmers who specifically were committed to regenerative practices and supporting them in that way. And along the way, having relationship with these farmers, learning about who they were and what their lives were like and what the pressures were on them to use various farming techniques. And it was just such a fascinating and inspiring example to me of what creative thinking and courage can lead to if you really believe that you can make a difference where you are, wherever you are.
Yeah, I like that. And your mention of women in Africa makes me think of Wangari Maathai, who was the woman in Kenya who some years ago was noticing the impacts on soil of deforestation and farming and things like that. And she thought, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, she went on to start a tree planting project that has been hugely successful. And she went on to do many other things, but that's where it all started. And she eventually received the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of her efforts. So this is what one person can do. A lot with other people. Yeah, I like that story, Forrest.
Yeah. Well, your writing calls us to new standards and new practices and new ways of thinking, but it also shows us that there's plenty of people who are already modeling new ways forward. Given that more and more people are understanding the value of regenerative agriculture, for example, is your book, would you say it's more a reflection of movement in the right direction, or does it feel more like you're trying to spark a movement that doesn't yet have momentum?
Well, I guess I would say it's a little bit of both. 15 years ago when I wrote the Dirt book that got Ann and I started thinking about along these lines that ended up with What's Your Food Aid is the most recent. There were very few people talking about soil health and about changing farming along those lines. Now you go to farming conferences and everybody there's talking about it. There's session after session about it. And you've got a whole new generation of younger farmers who have actually come in to do these regenerative practices and aren't steeped in the old ways. When I first started going to farming practices or seeing some of the early adopters of what we would now call regenerative practices, talking about their decades-long history of figuring out what to do and how to change their farm and improve their soil. And now you've got farmers who are out of the gate adopting those practices and making great strides in improving and enhancing the health of the soil on their farms, literally around the world. So it's not like we're calling for changes that nobody knows how to do. But I think what we're calling for is for wider adoption of changes that pioneering farmers around the world have figured out how to tweak methods and ways to adapt to their landscapes. And they could really use our support, whether intellectual or through how we're spending our money or legislatively, because there's a lot of upsides to adopting a less environmentally destructive style of agriculture that has the ability to feed the world in ways that provide more of compounds that actually bolster human health. And that's what we're really arguing for, sort of a reframing of our global agricultural enterprise to prioritize not just feeding the world, but rebuilding healthy, fertile soils and better nourishing the world.
I love the fact that in the book, you really make farmers into heroes. You have so many super great stories to write about farmers who are doing these new things and discovering new things and finding out that to do these new things is not a sacrifice. It's actually maybe making them more money to support their families and making their farms ultimately healthier. And I just find so much inspiration in the stories of the farmers. And the farmers don't get a lot of attention, I have to say, maybe not enough. I realized as I was reading these stories that I want to know more of these stories. And as you said, Dave, I want to support them. I want to figure out what I can do to support the work on the cutting edge, which is really where they're living. I'm wondering if when we talk about these stories of farmers or other people who are doing creative things that you cite, are you, on balance, hopeful about the future? Are we moving in the right direction? And what do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think, on balance, I am hopeful. And I think when you see things that are happening and when you talk with farmers and they say things like, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I couldn't find hardly any life in my soil. And then, I started to be thinking more about organic matter. And then once I realized that soil life thrives on organic matter, whether that's decomposing animal manures or dead plant parts or some of the things that are really important for feeding soil life are these compounds that plants actually make themselves and release through their roots into the soil. And when I hear farmers talking about things like that, I get excited because they get it. And once they get it, they take that knowledge and they transfer it into practices that influence the land and that influence the kinds of foods that end up on our dinner table. And so I am hopeful, and I know those types of farmers are out there. And I know, like Dave had mentioned, there's a lot of younger farmers coming into agriculture, and it makes me really hopeful about all of these younger people who sort of see the landscape maybe differently than a farmer who is closer to the end of their career. And the younger farmers are thinking things like, we can do this, I can do this, I know how to do this. And so it's that old adage, I'm not great with metaphors all the time, so correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but you know, the one that goes about, do you give somebody a fish every day so that they can eat, or do you give them a fishing pole so that they can go out and learn how to pull in these fish for themselves? And that's what the younger farmers are doing. They're equipped with dozens of different fishing poles, and they're out there using them. I like how you talk about the opportunity and the courage to be doing things differently. So really, that's what, on balance, I am more hopeful than I am pessimistic about things in terms of the soil health.
Yeah, I'm going to say about younger farmers, I agree. I'm making the same observation. And I think one other difference about younger farmers, and this is worldwide in many different countries, that they also feel like their farming is more than farming. They have a sense of purpose, right? They have a sense of social responsibility almost. They understand the plight of the earth, and they understand that they are an important part of helping us to a better place. So I think that sense of social mission is setting them apart as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Dave, what about you? Are you hopeful?
Yeah. You know, I tend to take a fairly long view. We still have a long way to go to make a more regenerative, soil-friendly style of agriculture, the conventional agriculture of the future. But I think we're on track to get there. It may take us a few decades. It may take us many retirements and a whole lot of new farmers. But eventually that happens. And so I think we're moving in the right direction in terms of growing interest and growing support. There's still a lot to be done to figure out really how to do it, how to operationalize it. When we look at the term regenerative, how to define it, how to assess it, there's going to be lots of arguments over that in the next few years. But I think we're starting to see the big global agricultural ships starting to turn a little bit towards more soil-friendly practices for some fairly simple reasons. The price of fertilizer has gone through the roof in the last year, and it's illustrated how non-resilient sort of a global agriculture that depends on a whole lot of nitrogen to grow very few crops can be if that gets disrupted. So the idea of moving to more soil-friendly practices that don't need as much fertilizer and diversifying our crops and diversifying our diet, so it would be a recipe for resilience. I think there's a lot of factors that are going to help push agriculture along towards a more regenerative direction, but there's a whole lot of other benefits besides the economic ones to be harvested as well, you know, in terms of the health of the land and the health of our population.
If we were to, sum up the book, if somebody really was like, well, they talked about a lot, like what is it really all about? It kind of comes down to this. If through farming, a practice is good for the land, and by that, let's make sure we include the community of life that is in the soil, community of life that is a part of the farm. And when practices enhance and conserve and protect those communities, chances are it's going to be really good for human health as well. So if it's good for the land, it's good for us.
We've been in conversation with Dave Montgomery and Ann Biklé about their new book, What Your Food Ate: How to Heal Our Land and Reclaim Our Health. For more information about this and other books in the Dirt trilogy, go to the show notes for this podcast episode. Also, I'll be doing a special Q&A session with James in the fall. So if you have any question or comment on any of the episodes from the past year, or just have a question for James or me, use the voice message function on the podcast webpage or send us an email at earthkeepers@circuit.online. If you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe or follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. I'm Forrest Inslee, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Wolfers. Timothy Connor is our editor, and Forrest Reed is the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening, and please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.